Hello, everyone, and welcome to my first clip on Susan K. Langer. This is our first reading in the ad hoc design studio this semester, New Materialist Articulations. The book by Langer is entitled Philosophy in a New Key, and in my short introduction here, I would like to contextualize a little bit this interest in what she calls a new key in a larger context that regards measurement, optics, scale, and basically the core of new materialism. So I want to contrast a little bit the emphasis on a new key with an emphasis of another scale, or rather the way of thinking about a scale in a different way. And it is precisely with respect to this that Langer's work has been so extremely inspiring and interesting to my research. It is not concerned directly with architecture. Rather, Langer's work is interested, as the subtitle of her book says, a study in the symbolism of reason, right, and art. What she's interested in is how to relate to a kind of a meaningfulness, or Iris would call it a resourcefulness, that lies outside of language, or if you want, beyond the limits of the rational. And the interest is to relate to this domain by a way that doesn't try to mystify it, but rather that deals quite objectively and also to a certain extent logically with this possibility. So philosophy in a new key basically says that concepts are fertile. Yeah. So the term literally means a concept. It's the same term like a conception. So it has something to do with a reception and something biological as well. And she's very radical because she attributes this to concepts at large. She was herself a philosopher who studied with two of the most rigorous, we could say, philosophers in the early 20th century, with Alfred North Whitehead and Ernst Cassirer, both of them mathematicians and both of them very much interested in a new kind of role that symbols begin to play. So in their time, computers were not non-existent, but a different sort of reality than we are living with today. Yet the role of the symbols that they were concerned with has only become drastically evident after 1 century later. And Susanne K. Langer was one of the very first philosophers who tried to open up a different path that wouldn't separate nature and objectivity on the one side, or what we call natural sciences, and the cultural sciences on the other hand. But rather she was interested in how there is a communication between the two. And this is also the background before which I would like to briefly talk about. So, first, I want to contextualize with the topics in my Architektur Theorie 2 lecture from last semester, where the topic was an interest in scale and the a bit bold, perhaps, but super interesting hypothesis that through rethinking scale, we can rethink space beyond the question of, has it always already been given in a certain way, according to the Euclidean axioms, for example, or Euclidean geometry, that many people would maintain, or is it just an illusion? Is it just a fancy in our subjective minds? We can go beyond precisely this dualism, if you want, by saying, well, what if space itself is being abducted out of time? So this was the thesis here. I want to be very brief now in giving you a little bit of the context where this is all coming from. As architects, I would expect most of you are well familiar with the work by Ray and Charles Eames. It's a film which is called The Powers of 10, and it's a film which starts out with a couple picnicking. I think it's in the Central Park in New York, but I'm not sure. You see them here, and then the camera leaves in logarithmic steps of the powers of 10, so 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 10, and gets further and further and further away into the cosmos, into the galaxies, as far as it is possible, and then comes back, and goes under the skin of these people, no? Proportionally in the same amount of distance. It is a very beautiful and a very impressive document, but with respect to our interest in a different understanding of scale, it is precisely on the wrong side. Yeah? And that is because it equates scale to dimension. So the dimension is established what they call according to powers of 10, but powers of 10 is but a logarithm. No? Powers of 10 means to the exponential of 10, and of 10, and of 10, and of 10. So in equal steps. Whereas what we are actually confronted with in contemporary science is that scale and dimension, they are not synonyms. Yeah? So there is not always equal steps in abstraction. Power of 10, again, self-referential to another power of 10 to another power of 10, but rather we are dealing with scales that are not commensurate in the same way. So they need to be translated into each other. And the basis of what digitization is all about, because it too is quantum physical, like our astrophysics today, it's quantum physics, confronts us with the same challenge, let's say. There is one book which lends itself well to explain the importance of this distinction, because it's not merely an aesthetic preference or something like that. And it's a book which was edited by quite renowned French physicists, astrophysicists, and I believe also a biologist, entitled Le Grand Récit de l'Univers. And what it does is it gives a kind of a popular but a very precise and super amazing insight into contemporary astrophysics. And what is specific about contemporary astrophysics, perhaps, is that the core question concerns the creation or the origins of matter itself, of materiality itself. This is not a picture from the book, but so that you know what we are talking about. It is about the book, or contemporary astrophysics gives us a context of how we think scientifically today about the birth of an entire galaxy. A birth of an entire galaxy is usually starting with the birth of a sun, and the sun is this, from a philosophical point of view, really amazing body where light and mass are the same thing. Yeah? So a sun is the source of the emission of light in a galaxy, but at the same time, it is the most heavy body there is. It has a sun collects, attracts, collects, and embodies mass in a galaxy. So matter and light start to behave or to be put into a constellation which we are not well equipped to address. And it is this new relation between light and matter, or in German we would say Stofflichkeit des Lichtes, no? Kind of a materiality, a stuffiness. This is clumsy. The English doesn't have such a, in this case, such a well-fitted word like Stofflichkeit. And it doesn't mean that there is no light, only matter, or that light itself is the same like matter. No, evidently it is not. And this double character is at the core of quantum physics. It makes almost every quantum physics at the same time a quantum optics. Even if it's not about instruments that allow a subject like here, no, to take pictures and to telescope into dimensions that were not accessible to our sight before. It is not just about making pictures of these things, but on a material level, everything is quantum optics. So quantum optics means we are dealing with respect to matter, with spectras. That means with polarities where we have a positive and a negative pole, and all the frequency spectra in between, like all the colors between black and white. This applies to aromas, it applies to chemical substances, it applies to DNA, It applies to almost everything that we engage with in terms of information technology. So that means for a spectra, there is a figure, it's no longer the line which goes from a cause to an effect, but we have oscillations, we have cycles, we have a cyclicity at work in matter itself. The language is, the concepts which relate to this are in a way quite precise, but we are not attending to them in that way. We speak of data, no, in information technology, and data literally means givens. But what we hardly ever address is how it comes that data is a given. Yeah? Because of course there is a kind of an abstract machinery behind it. We will see that this has a lot to do with the role of the symbols that Susan K. Langer addresses in terms of, I think she calls it metaphysical projections. So there is a new interest in topics which which bring us to attend differently to time, no? To time in a material kind of sense. So there are topics you encountered them. There are ideas of kind of a materiality of time, of a grande durée. This is how I think it was Braudel who called it like that. A kind of a duration which can accommodate the coexistence of many scales and also their evolution in an at least indeterminate way. So this here is from the back cover of the Grand Récit here, the back cover text. And what I would like to highlight about it is two things. On the one hand, this whole story is called Le Grand Récit, and the récit is not just a narrative. It's not just a report either. So it intervenes between what we usually separate as object and as subject. Récit comes from recevoir, and it has in itself the idea that it needs to be received. There needs to be a reception of what this story is going to talk about. And for this reception, we have the relation to bigness, to grand. So a measurement term, a magnitude term, and this we can take it very literal. If we allow our basic concepts with which we feel to be familiar, no? A few people would say that matter needs to be somehow reconceived, or light needs to be reconceived, or space needs to be reconceived, or time, or force, or movement. So these are the key terms for every metaphysics. This is how something like a natural philosophy and a philosophy at large started out some 2,500 years ago. But it is precisely these terms which are up for reconsideration, let's say. If we want to say that as vocabulary, these terms need to be compatible, they need to maintain actively compatibility with the state of the art of a contemporary science. And contemporary science is electricity, and it is quantum physics, and it is astrophysics at the same time. This is what the authors of this book put forward. So this text here is from the back cover of the book, and it explicitly says our basic vocabulary is no longer adequate. So they aim at providing a lexicon which revisits those words which seem so familiar, like matter, light, space, time, force, and movement, but are actually not. So it's about revisiting these words, and perhaps we could say that a common interest to what is called new materialism as a kind of a school of thinking, perhaps, or a discourse, a particular discourse, we could say shares as an interest. Now, let's very briefly think about some implications of this, because it's not just about becoming erudite and knowing, being well informed about a science of the time. There are implications to this, and one book which worked this out is this one here. It's by Michel Serres, who also wrote the preface to the book on Le Grand Récit de l'Univers. He's a French philosopher who has died 2 years ago, almost 2 years ago now. And in 2013, he wrote a book with the title Times of Crisis. And you see, it's about money, the euro, the dollar. The subtitle is What the Financial Crisis Revealed and How to Reinvent Our Lives and Future. And what he begins to say here is that has always been the case that the way that we can relate to time is through criticality. So time is that with which we can always only be critical. So times of crisis doesn't say the year 2013 where there was this financial crisis was a year of extraordinary events and of crisis. Rather, what he sets out to do here is to reconsider the nature of time itself in terms of crisis through discussing it in the example of the financial crisis. So I'll be very brief in showing you the main lines. He begins by saying, the financial crisis of 2013, we should regard it as a kind of an earthquake. Its logics should be regarded as a kind of an earthquake. And this is because earthquakes, they cause perhaps sometimes just one ripple on the ground or a few cracks and fissures in works of art, bridges and buildings. After thousands of years of earthquakes, a large crevice appears in the landscape like those in Iceland or the San Andreas Fault in California. After they become visible and are printed on a map, those traces and marks both reveal and hide a giant fault at the level of the lower plates that move slowly but then suddenly break off unseen in tectonic abysses. The fault is the underlying cause of all the surface movements. Yeah? So what he presents us with here is a kind of a combination, we could say, between the usual model in which we think logically, which goes from a cause to certain effects, in a straight line or in a differential line, like in linear algebra, it doesn't really matter, but there is this progressing direction. We are very much used to think like this. Quantum physics, on the other hand, gives us this predominance of cyclicity, of frequencies, of oscillations, of spectrality, of things which go in circle, very literally. And things that go in circle don't proceed in a line. But the picture of the earthquake is precisely one where the two kinds of abstractions, or we could say the two optical instruments of abstract imagination, work together. Because there is a deep lying cause, but it's not one. It's one in which many factors contribute through building up a kind of a tension that needs to bridge and also that falls into several plates or stratas, that pertain to different time scales, to very different time scales. So the events that happen as on the surface are very contemporary. They touch us most, yes? But the causes to it lie much deeper. And this model now, he says, we need to apply it when we try to understand what is happening in finance markets today. There are these kinds of surface effects. That doesn't mean they're not grave. Yeah, that's not a trivialization of the matter, but it's a different way of framing it. But the reasons for it, we need to go much deeper. And these reasons, they have something to do with the word crisis. So the definition of the word crisis he gives us is making the relation to judgment. So crisis has something to do with a judgment, with an assessment, with a kind of something unforeseen, something, not an event. So something, a crisis is breaking a certain horizon of expectations. It's breaking a certain continuity. A crisis is when something happens that people have not expected. That was not to be expected. So a crisis and an event, they're very close with respect to each other. But there is something very colloquial about the crisis. And he describes this as a certain stance towards events which one observes. And the example he gives is that of a theatre critic who goes to see a play and then gives a summary of the play, a short one, because he doesn't want to give away the plot. Yeah, it's not a summary. He doesn't reproduce the play he saw. He leaves it imminent, but he gives a judgment on it. He says, in the end, it was an excellent play, for example. So it's this kind of judgment. Yeah, it's not a judgment that would be ontological or that would be in any of this grave sense. It's a kind of a judgment which is very colloquial, we are used to say, and it is such a faculty of judgment which he now wants to recognize with regard to the gravest problems of the world. And this is a very radical proposal, but it's a very, very interesting one, because it goes in the direction of gluing or bridging these different optics, these different lenses that are at work in cultural and in natural science. So what he then does in this book is not simply preach that we should all do this. He gives us the possibility of finding a metrics to objectify such judgments. And what he does is he says we need to learn to measure the importance of an event. So if our relation to time is always one in terms of crisis, so we establish a sense of history by attending to events that close or interrupt a certain continuity, a certain duration, then everything is part of a crisis. So we need to figure out what is the importance of one crisis versus another. And he gives us an architectonic means to do so. He says we can assume that there is a proportionality in terms of which we can measure the importance and the novelty of an event. And this proportionality relates now to how long has been the period which is de facto being closed by a crisis that happens. And as an example, he speaks about the turn in our lives that more than 50% of the world population nowadays lives in cities and no longer directly from agriculture. In 1900 still it was something like 95% of the world population which were directly living from agriculture. So what this event, this change in lifestyles, what it measures, what it closes, is a period of continuity which we usually call the Neolithicum. It's the age, the anthropological age, since humans have become settlers, since they have started to cultivate systematically the land and remain territorial, let's say. This period is being closed by the event of the changed lifestyles. So this is an event, or if you want, a crisis, which weighs very, very heavy, compared to others. I just want to give you this as a picture to how to imagine what he is talking about. It is a very powerful mindset to address two things that happen on all the scales, on personal ones, but also on very large ones. And the impact of learning to think like this is important because it relates to the power of contemporary technology, which crystallizes currently in artificial intelligence, in a kind of predictability and calculability of almost every problem that we address scientifically. What Serre says is there is a kind of an intellectuality with which we always need to engage, because what is attributed to this Neolithic turn is the development of science, of abstraction, of forms of culture, which we call intellectual, of knowledge, that has been geared by its challenges. So its challenges has produced a form of intellect which is, on the one hand, it's natural, but on the other hand, there's a cultural evolution that relates to it. But the intellectuality as a faculty will not go away. So our thinking has domesticated this, it has learned this. So we cannot just stop thinking, So we can't get rid of it. So we need to relate to it in a different way, because we need to turn it to, he calls it a reform of the understanding, in a way that does a shift. This now has to do with the materiality that we are concerned with in this course. With a shift in the distinction between the importance of what he calls the hard versus the soft. The hard is classical materiality related to thermodynamics, to classical physics. So it is matter which is hard and heavy, which qualifies classical technology, and the soft relates to everything electric, or information technological. And what this crisis now of the end of the Neolithicum or the change of our lifestyles means is that a very long period where our intellect and our understanding were sharpening themselves, were training themselves in how we can deal with the heart, now needs to shift and learn to think how we can deal with the soft. Yeah. So information economy, in globalized lifestyles, this is all information driven. What is truly existential today for the ways in which we live is to a greater degree what is called soft, not the hard. And soft doesn't mean now it's subjective and not objective and you can't measure it and it's all a question of interpretation. These are precisely the prejudices which are at stake when we need to overcome this distinction, not to overcome, to bridge or to reframe, to think differently about the relation between the hard sciences and the humanities. So it is about the reform of the understanding, which would start to attend to the soft. And you know, it's not just a cliche that today keywords like participatory politics, participatory project, forms of collaborations, sharing of data, sharing of access, sharing of platforms and so on. These are all terms which follow these logics of a soft. They're not less reliable and by no means less powerful. No? So this we know, after Trump we know how powerful these logics are, but they're different than the hard ones. So it's about this reform of the understanding because, yeah, let's just read this passage because it's very auf den Punkt gebracht. No? So Sarah writes, Homo sapiens has intelligence. He never stopped using its power, but mostly to dominate, to go first, become the strongest, to crush everything and everybody on his way, and to win. With intelligence as a weapon, he conquered nature and his miserable peers in the course of a warring evolution that is ending with a victory, however so paradoxical it might in turn lead to the species' eradication. So what he means is, of course, the Anthropocene. So how can this defeat be avoided? By changing this defective weapon, yes, I mean intelligence. Good, with this, let's go back to Lange's book. Philosophy in a New Key. We already saw, or I already explained, how this role of symbols in mathematics that relates to physics, that means to materiality, in a quantum kind of way, was very much what she was preoccupied with. Let's see now a few passages of how she attends to this and how this notion of the key can be brought into relation with an interest in scale. She writes, this is the very first chapter, which is entitled The New Key. Every age in the history of philosophy has its own preoccupation. Its problems are peculiar to it, not for obvious practical reasons, political or social, but for deeper reasons of intellectual growth. If we look back on the slow formation and accumulation of doctrines which mark this history, we may see certain groupings of ideas within it, not by subject matter, but by a subtler common factor, which may be called their technique. It is the mode of handling problems, rather than what they are about, that assigns them to an age. Their subject matter may be fortuitous and depend on conquests, discoveries, plagues, and governments. Their treatment derives from a steadier source. So what we see here is this idea, no? When we say we need to reinvent the basic concepts of time, space, movement, force, life, no? We should add. That doesn't mean that the substance of it changes, but it changes that our techniques, our technologies in handling those basic terms, this evolves, this changes. And how to think about such change now in a way which doesn't go from a line that has primitive at the beginning and heads towards a line of most progressive. So how to get rid of this progressivism that was so dominant ever since Enlightenment revolutions. How can we get rid of that without losing the historicity, no? Or the historicity and the change, the possibility of change and the affirmation of intellection and of science. For this, she speaks of a new key, and the new key, you can think of it, of course, on the one hand, like a key to a door. Yeah? So there is a device which is made to fit a certain lock. So with the key, there are involved questions of access. And on a coding level, the issue of key relates to cryptography. And what is interesting here is that with cryptography, yes, it is about treating a certain source text or an original text in such a manner that it can be transmitted, that it can be transported to another domain, to another moment, or something like that, without losing its content. So it's a kind of a packaging. Cryptography is a kind of a packaging, and yet it demands a kind of a literacy. So one needs to be initiated, one needs to have the key in order to decrypt, in order to decipher. But the interesting thing is that this level of cryptography or of keys does not affect meaning in its substance in a way that we would call ontological. But it does affect meaning in its substance, because depending on where the keys fit, we find ourselves in a very different world of one and the same meaning. No? So like energy is a term which has come to mean something very different since we have the atomic bomb, since we are calculating, counting time by the weight of atoms. Yeah, energy has become something different. But of course, physically it was always the same, like at the time of thermodynamics, when they began to relate energy to a universal property, which was heat. No? So the big revolution there was, there is not a single thing which exists and does not have a temperature. This was amazing, but it unlocked as a kind of a scientific spirit and growth. Or earlier before, no? When algebra was introduced in the late medieval times, in the early Renaissance time, it was a way to invent completely new machines. All the measurement devices that propelled the modern revolution, they would not be unthinkable without algebra and the domestication of the zero through mathematical symbols. And these measurement devices at the core all treat energy and stuff and matter in a different way. But this doesn't mean that the world has changed. No, I mean, it has changed, but there is a physicality which we can call it remains invariant, but the ways through which it appears to us, and let's say the gates, the symbolical gates and thresholds, in terms of which we can engage with it, they change. And this is the key idea of Susanne Langer. So he says, it changes with the treatment, and the technique which is at work in a treatment. Of this, she says, a technique or a treatment of a problem, it always begins with its first expression as a question. And now here is something important for new materialist articulations. When we have questions, the point is not which one is the right answer. The point is always what is at stake in these questions. If we begin to say, a certain question is no longer relevant to us, the example she gives is indeed the question, who made the world? So when we can explain in terms of the Big Bang, a physics of the birth of stars and galaxies, who needs an assumption of whether there was a creator or not when we want to remain in science? Yeah? So this gets rid of all of the metaphysical aspirations and interests, let's say. But why should it be necessary? And yet, if we just demand, this question is nonsense, let's not attend to it, we are rejecting the question. And with that, we are throwing away an enormously rich and resourceful toolbox of equipment of how to ask questions well, better, more differentiated, in novel ways. The point is not that we want to hold on to the importance of the idea of a creator. The point is that we need to hold on to this whole equipment of how to treat problems creatively, of tools, of toolbox. So Langer's suggestion is that whenever we want to understand what somebody is saying, we always need to ask. So the way that we need to ask is not a good question versus a bad question, but we need to ask, what is, let's say, what is the blinded, the Anatheme, no? Das Anathema, also what is the background before a certain postulate, a certain program, a certain project. So to understand what is at stake in something. Because there are always common sense notions which seem so common sense that we don't question them. But with truly interesting and novel and daring ideas, it is always those common notions which are somehow related to differently. Like our publication about Le Grand Récit de l'Univers invites us to reconsider the most basic notions, which we are all somehow employing in our common sense reasoning. So here she introduces something important. She relates very, I would say, very compatible with how Michel Serres begins to say so crisis and history, or crisis and objective or natural time, not the age of the cosmos, the time that is at work in science, in hard science, not psychological time, not time experience, but an objective time. Is related to crisis. She begins to say that there is always a logical projection at work when we are dealing with metaphysics. So when we are asking these questions, which seem so untimely today, what we can learn, notice the qualities of these toolboxes, they have to do with something she calls logical projection. And the logical projection, I would say, is the thinking at work in optical instruments that treats an understanding of light and sight and vision quantitatively, precisely, but in a way which can never exhaustively be described. So it always needs logical projection, combines logics with a kind of a mechanic or a creative, and that's also something. No, mechanics and creativity, they no longer exclude one another in techniques. Resourcefulness, to take this beautiful term that is so central for Iris's chair of resourcefulness in cultural inquiry. Now imagine there is a university chair for resourcefulness in cultural inquiry. Wonderful. So we need to relate, if we want to have a historic zone, when we want to say there is a kind of a history or an evolution or a changing in metaphysical thought, because if we don't allow for that, we become super dogmatic. But if we allow for that, then classically that would mean we lose the metaphysics of it, because then we let go of it. No, we relativize it. It becomes just a language game. It becomes just a worldview or an ideology, but it doesn't. If we relate a plurality or a change of these manners of thinking to devices which we call the devices of a quantum optics in terms of logical projection. And the quantum optics is just to say we need to think it on the height of today's science. So 200 years ago it wouldn't have made sense to call it quantum logics. It would have had to be dynamics, analytical geometry, no? analytical mechanics, Lagrange and so on. But today it is quantum. When we relate the two, we get the domain of criticism, where it's not, well, there is a certain way of perhaps closed, no, truth at stake, like in a play and the theatre critic. So the theatre critic doesn't just want to say I liked it or I didn't. No? So he gives a discourse about it. He will say why. He puts it in a frame of comparison. He wants it to acquire a certain, not only an intersubjectivity, but also an objectivity. And in a similar way, we can think of how truth can be at stake in metaphysical thinking that affirms change and evolution over time, and tries to measure the importance of these changes, which are always happening as crises, as cuts, in terms of what were the apparatuses or the optical devices at work in this logical projection that was exercised in a metaphysical proposition. And why this is important, she says, this here is, I like it very much, it's very beautiful. She says, no, it's not about becoming a mystic or turning science again into a kind of a theology or something like that. She simply says, no, I do not believe that there is a world in which is not physical or not in space-time, but I do believe that in this physical space-time world of our experience, there are things which do not fit the grammatical scheme of expressions. But they are not necessarily blind, inconceivable, mystical affairs. They are simply matters which require to be conceived through some symbolistic schema other than discursive language. And this domain now, other than discursive language, it doesn't mean we should no longer speak or words cannot help us. This is precisely what our course wants to explore in terms of methods of creative humanities. No? So how to be in language, how to think in language, and think with discourse without getting so comfortable in a particular specialized relevant because so specialized discourse or another. This is what we would like to introduce you to and to train with you. Because it's always about meaning. Yeah, I think we don't need to go into details. We already developed the main point. You got an idea. Here is then the link of this thinking to Weltanschauung, attitude of mind, or specific articles of faith. No? As a way to foreground how these logical projections always inform something like this, something like a Weltanschauung. But what we can do is, we can say, well, okay, it does, but it's not what we take very serious. What we want to take very serious is a form of the questions. Yeah. So the form of the questions means we ask about how is such a Weltanschauung constituted? What is the optics behind it? And this emphasis on a form of the question, that is something we would like to show you, to introduce you to as a very powerful method, perhaps, of how to approach any design task at all, ad hoc, in an ad hoc manner. So what we call ad hoc has a lot to do with working out the shape of the question, and for a question, of course, you can substitute the design brief, what is the perfect house for customer X and X. It doesn't matter. You can always reformulate this in terms of a question and then work out the form of it. And then there is a way of how a conceptual architectonic thinking relates to very practical aspects of fabrication, of making things. And this interplay we would like to explore in the coming semester, and the writings of Susanne Langer are a beautiful key to unlock such a way of looking at things. I want to close this with a cornucopian instrument as a picture. Yeah? So yes, it is about technique, it is about technology, it is about devices, instruments, apparatuses, and yes, they are rational, but they are also resourceful. So I look very forward to experience and explore with you where we are going to be led in this semester.